But then, towards the end of 2009 and the spring of 2010, there came the sovereign debt problems in Greece, Spain, and Portugal. And here we also see a shift to austerity in these countries, which was needed. There was a fear of currency contagion, and this led to the safety net bill out of the EU. Through it all, the Commission was largely invisible. Again, the ECB acted very swiftly in this respect. And with the new governments in the UK, the Netherlands and Germany a little bit back, there is an abrupt shift towards fiscal austerity, to try to show, to be bold, also to the Greeks to say, you know, we're doing it, you can do it as well. And this is, I think, rather risky. The US takes a different approach, sticks to Keynesianism, and have moved towards a massive effort of quantitative easing. And that's also the reason why I think Seoul, the G20, was a failure. But you know, the two previous meetings were actually pretty good, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, if you take this short history at face value, what should be done? And you know, it's easy to say by a technocrat or a professor in economy what should be done, but it's really politics that matters in this respect. But let me say what I think should be done. First of all, there needs to be an orderly exit. This is a once-in-a-generation kind of crisis, like the 1930s and the early 1980s, and those crises took, you know, 10 to 15 years to get over. So don't try to sort of be bold and go and think that in the 1990s we've sort of managed this in a couple of years. So there needs to be fiscal consolidation, but it has to be accompanied with growth, and that growth has to be done in fairness. So no rules-based adjustment, going back to the old Stability Pact, but much more discretionary EU political space. Much better balance between growth strategy, and much more interlinked with domestic economic and social policy. We've lost a big chunk of GDP in the European Union. So the future, if we want to sort of maintain our living standards, has to be done through investing in participation and productivity. And for this, we need, at the social side of the story, a social investment strategy, not trying to see the welfare state, as we used to do in the neoliberal days, as an impediment to market forces. And this has to be enforced through much better monitoring mechanism from which we can learn rather than, you know, punish laggards. But then, you know, is this feasible? We may agree, we may not agree, but you know, let's say we agree with this. Is this feasible? Well, here, politics matters, and I think, you know, this is the really the biggest problem. I mean, I think Clinton once used to say, you know, it's the economy stupid, and for today, my line would be it's politics stupid. Because there are two important restorative forces debating the situation at this very moment. One is to sort of go back to the sort of stability-oriented regimes of the 1980s. And remember, the 1980s regime was not a bad regime, it was a good regime vis-a-vis the problems of the 1970s. And the problems of the 1970s were indeed rigidities in the real economy. This crisis is much more like the 1930s crisis. This is a financial crisis. So if we go back very swiftly to the rules-based policies of the 1980s, I think we're going to choke growth and recovery. So that's the first restorative force. The second restorative force, very prominent in my country, is to sort of go back to the cozy welfare state of the 1950s, which never existed. I mean, my father didn't have long holidays that I had. He had to work on Saturdays. But this is the image that is portrayed, especially by the populist xenophobic movements, that, you know, when the welfare state was all white, you know, we took care of one another. And, you know, I have to say, these days are over. We cannot go back to the 1980s, we cannot go back to the 1950s. But But still, we have huge difficulties at the institutional side, because the nation state, as we know it today, has become institutionally incomplete, because we also have the EU. State capacity is massively constrained after neoliberalism and the global crisis, both in practice and in money, but also intellectually. At the level of the polity, we face, especially in my country again, but also in Sweden, isolationist populism who are very jealous of any kind of deal struck between countries across borders. And all this in a climate that's distrustful of markets and states with few budgetary resources. I'm going to finish here. I think we're in the middle of a period of transition, and we really don't know where it will go. Now, to try to be a little bit on the upbeat or optimistic side, I would say the glass is half full, because we are intellectually today debating that taming and re-regulation of markets, especially financial markets, are no longer dirty words. That's good news. There is return of global governance, the G20. The first two were a success, the second maybe not, depending on what the outcome is of the current currency war. There's renewed attention to the demand side of the economy. There's no full swing back to Keynesianism, that's not the issue. But anti-cyclical thinking is back not only in academia but also in the policymaking side. Blaming the victim, which was possible in the 1980s, blaming the victim, those are the welfare beneficiaries, we can no longer do that because they are not to blame. And in fact, in most of our countries, and maybe not Greece or Spain, labor markets are in fact pretty flexible. So there is also a need, although there is austerity, of a re-legitimization of social policy. And there is a debate that growth should be contingent on other substantive objectives, such as the environment. And our thinking of the state is one of more of an enabling state. There is, I think, one of my main lessons of the crisis is that states and markets, and they always were, are truly complementary. There is no market without a state and vice versa. But we used to think in the 1950s, that the state should, take the lead, and maybe it should now as well for some time, and the markets take over. And in the 1980s, the idea was, markets should really trump state because states are bad for economic integration. And now we know that there is a fundamental complementarity between states and markets, and that the political class has a responsibility vis-a-vis the economy and society. So when we go back to the big regimes that we have seen throughout the post-war era until the crisis, and we go back to embedded liberalism, one should notice that this regime is now highly popular in China and Brazil. They're improving their healthcare, their education systems, and their pensions. And they're still popular as a social welfare state in the West and Eastern Europe. So a rethinking and re-legitimization of the welfare state is on the way in the face of real negative social consequences. Now, with respect to the regime of neoliberalism, what we take over from that is international economic interdependence. We haven't seen real economy protectionism yet. There is a currency war. But the reason that there is a currency war is that we're so interdependent these days that real protectionism would be a real disaster, and everybody knows that. There is tepid deglobalization, and maybe in due course higher transport costs would also constrain the globalization somewhat. But the world has become truly interdependent. So then the question becomes, is embedded globalization an option? I think it's a must because of climate change, but then we have to think back a year ago to Copenhagen, which was